Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 7, The Peace Conference. How wide is the contrast between the conditions of the Peace Conference in 1919 and those in which the Congress of Vienna had met in 1814? In 1814, the victorious Allies were in effective possession of practically the whole of Europe. They had the physical power to impose their will. In 1919, the dangers were more acute and the victors were much more exhausted. Large regions and cardinal factors remained outside their control. In 1814, a group of aristocrats, life-trained as statesmen and diplomatists, utterly wearied of war and hating change, met together in elegant and ceremonious privacy to re-establish and fortify, after 20 years of tumult, a well-understood conservative system of society. In 1919, the orators and mass leaders who had risen to the dizzy summits of power and victory in the rough and tumble of the struggle all balanced themselves precariously upon the unsure shifting platform of public opinion, and claimed to be guiding mankind to higher destinies. Public opinion was, it is true, focused and steadied to some extent by the parliaments, but it was also vehemently swayed by the press. In 1814, calm, deliberate conclaves of comfortable and firmly established personages. In 1919, a turbulent collision of embarrassed demagogues who were also great men of action, each of whom had to produce a triumph for himself and his party and give satisfaction to national fears and passions, well-founded or not. In these circumstances, the historian of the future must judge, much less their shortcomings and failures than their substantial achievements. The literature upon the Peace Conference, represented in almost every language, is large, and that upon the peace itself far larger. The first place must be assigned to Dr. Temperley's monumental work. Although Dr. Temperley did not feel at liberty to publish all the information and documents at his disposal, his 6 volumes hold their place as the unique and indispensable guide for any student. Of French books, Monsieur Tardieu's The Truth About the Treaty is the most important, partly because he was one of those who acted for France at the conference, and partly because he publishes many documents which have not appeared elsewhere. Monsieur Mermet has also in his Combat des Trois printed important extracts from the secret minutes of the Supreme Council and from those of the Council of Four. The principal Italian contribution is comprised in 3 volumes from Signor Nitti. The American point of view is represented first by Mr. Stannard Baker's Woodrow Wilson and the World Settlement, of which more later. Secondly, in Colonel House's papers, edited by Mr. Seymour, and thirdly by Mr. Lansing's Peace Negotiations. There is also the admirable and scholarly drafting of the Covenant by Mr. David Hunter Miller. And on the Russian aspect, Dennis, Foreign Policy of Soviet Russia and Russian-American Relations, compiled by Messrs. Cumming and Petit. Mr. Stannard Baker's work is distinguished from all these publications both by the wealth of secret information at his disposal and the peculiar manner in which he has used it. President Wilson at the end of 1920 placed at the disposal of this gentleman, formerly the head of his press bureau while in Paris, 2 trunks and 3 steel boxes containing all his records of the Peace Conference. "I plunked them into the trunk in Paris," he wrote, "and have not had time or physical energy even to sort or arrange them." Mr. Baker lost little time in presenting these treasures to the world in the form of a sustained defense of the President's conduct and policy. In his object of vindicating his honored chief, Mr. Baker will be supported by the sympathy of the Allied nations, and certainly it is not from them that much harsh criticism has come. Everyone recognizes the high motives which inspired Mr. Wilson's actions, his remarkable abilities, his comprehensive goodwill, and his readiness to arrive at practical solutions. He was a good friend, not only to the Allies but to Europe. He faced the real facts as he gradually got to know them, not only with lofty idealism, but with sympathy and common sense. The part he played in the making of the treaties was marked by the strictest loyalty and good faith, and the last remnants of his life and strength were freely expended in trying to make good the obligations into which he had entered and to which he had pledged his country. His memory should long command the sympathy of Europe. But Mr. Baker detracts from the vindication of his hero by the absurd scenario picture which he has chosen to paint. Wilson's share in the peace conference, his hopes, his mistakes, his achievements, his compromises, and his disasters are worthy of something better than the Hollywood setting with which we are provided. In conventional film style, all the lights are heightened and all the shadows darkened. The apparatus of lurid contrast is lavishly employed. A plot suited to the more fruity forms of popular taste is chosen, and the treatment of facts, events, and personalities is compelled to conform to its preconceived requirements. For this purpose the President is represented as a stainless Sir Galahad championing the superior ideals of the American people and brought to infinite distress by contact with the awful depravity of Europe and its statesmen. Mr. Baker's film story is, in short, the oldest in the world. It is nothing less and nothing more than the conflict between good and evil, between spiritual conceptions and material appetites, between generosity and greed, between moral earnestness and underhand intrigue, between human sympathy and callous selfishness. The plot is certainly sensational, but it hardly represents what actually happened. It is difficult to believe that the European immigrants, by whom America has been populated, took away with them all the virtues and left behind them all the vices of the races from which they had sprung, or that a few generations of residence on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean is sufficient to create an order of beings definitely superior in morals, in culture, and in humanity to their prototypes in Europe. The American sense of humor, it is hoped, will itself supply to such claims the necessary correctives. It would seem probable that on both sides of the Atlantic men find it easy to be disinterested upon questions which do not affect them directly, that they are often inclined to prescribed high principles for others to follow, that they can resist austerely other people's temptations. However, let us allow Mr. Stannard Baker to open his tale in his own fashion. 3 weeks and 3 days after the last victorious shots of the Great War had been fired by Yankee doughboys in the French Argonne, the American peace argosy, the George Washington with accompanying warships, dropped down through the bedecked and beflagged harbor of New York, a new Santa Maria on its extraordinary voyage of discovery to an unknown world. The great ship passed majestically out through the Narrows, with airplanes cutting the sky above and the forts on either hand roaring with unprecedented salutes of 21 guns, for never before had a President of the United States set sail for a foreign land. Modern technical conditions have given so great an extension to publicity that comparisons with other times are vitiated. It seems probable that no human being has ever centered in himself more hopes or enjoyed a greater, if transient, prestige than President Wilson as he paced the decks of the American peace argosy. But the reverse of the medal bore sinister emblems. Mr. Baker has depicted the difficulties which awaited the President in Europe, and the tragic contrast between his noble outlook and the degradation of the old diplomacy. He has not dwelt sufficiently upon the difficulties he left behind him in the United States. Here too the old Adam manifested itself in recalcitrant forms, and the spirit of party politics had raised its unregenerate head. But for this aspect we must turn to other authorities. The Republican Party view has been explained by Mr. Hollis. Footnote: in The American Heresy by Christopher Hollis, Sheed and Ward, Paternoster Row. End of footnote. In terms which, though disfigured by bias, undoubtedly described a widespread American opinion. The world was before him like a glass. The sight of it turned the head of the pedagogue, made prince. In November 1918 took place the elections to Congress. As the summer drew to an end, there began to trickle in from Democratic candidates throughout the country requests that the president give them a letter of endorsement. It was decided that the best plan would be for him to make a speech at some central Middle Western town, such as Indianapolis, in which he would appeal to the country not to favor one party rather than the other, but to give him a Congress which would support him in his leadership of the national effort of war. Burleson, the Postmaster General, had advised this plan, and went off to Texas for 10 days at the end of September, assured that his advice would be followed. On his return he found that behind his back the party politicians had brought pressure upon Wilson to cancel his speech at Indianapolis and instead to write a letter appealing for a Democratic Congress. This letter, Burleson found, had already been given to the press. It was interpreted, as Burleson foresaw that it would be, as an abominable slur upon the loyalty of Republicans, and its publication made certain an overwhelming Democratic defeat. Wilson was at the time, according to Mr. White's explanation, in the upper spiritual zone of idealism, and therefore not at leisure to correct the popular impression that the letter was sent on Burleson's responsibility. European opinion upon this episode is not important, but its consequences were formidable. The Republican Party, who had given much patriotic support to the president's war policy, deemed themselves gratuitously and outrageously insulted. The November election gave them a majority in Congress, and they already possessed a substantial majority in the Senate. The American Constitution requires the ratification of all treaties by the Senate. It seemed to British and French eyes very curious that in the war crisis President Wilson did not seize the opportunity of becoming a national rather than a party leader. It is still more remarkable that, confronted with the fact of a hostile majority in the Senate, he did not endeavor to associate that body as a whole with the treaty negotiations. It would have been impossible if the president had forced the issue for Republican senators to refuse to form part of a senatorial delegation to the peace conference. On the contrary, they would probably have been delighted to go, and Wilson could then have been assured that what he promised would not be repudiated. His strong party feeling and his sense of personal superiority led him to reject this indispensable precaution. The American peace argosy wended on across the waters bearing a man who had not only to encounter the moral obliquity of Europe, but to produce world salvation in a form acceptable to political enemies whom he had deeply and newly offended. Upon him centered the hopes of the world. Before him lay the naughty entanglements of Paris, and behind him the sullen veto of the Senate. Nevertheless, it was with no sense of personal inadequacy that the president surveyed his task. 3 days before the George Washington sailed into Brest Harbor, in a blaze of glory, the president called together a group of the delegation for a conference. There were 2 members of the Peace Commission itself on the ship, Secretary Lansing and Mr. White, Colonel House and General Bliss being already in Europe. But the great body of the delegation was made up of geographers, historians, economists, and others upon whom the President was to depend for the basic facts to be used in the coming discussions. Footnote: in Woodrow Wilson and the World Settlement by Ray Stannard Baker, Volume 1, page 9. End of footnote. After a few introductory remarks to the effect that he was glad to meet us, writes Dr. Isaiah Bowman, who alone kept a record of this meeting, the President remarked that we would be the only disinterested people at the peace conference, and that the men whom we were about to deal with did not represent their own people. Footnote: in The Drafting of the Covenant by David Hunter Miller, page 41. End of footnote. The first of these 2 statements can best be judged in the light of ultimate events. The second reveals an undoubted misconception. The European statesmen whom President Wilson was about to meet represented only too well, in the assertion of national claims and in severity to the beaten enemy, the views and wishes of their own peoples. They ceased and failed to represent them only in so far as they diverged from these hard standards, and guided by experience, tolerance, and detachment, sought to mitigate the misfortunes of the vanquished, or to disappoint their own national expectations. Orlando, in making the most extreme claims, fell short of Italian aspirations. The iron Clemenceau, the prop of France, was throughout and is today condemned by the French for weakness in championing his country. As for Lloyd George, he was not only fortified by an overwhelming majority, but actually embarrassed by the demands of the multitude for the unsparing punishment of the guilty. So far from these national leaders thrusting forward upon their own impulse a ruthless claim against the defeated, they were every one of them in danger of censure for lukewarmness. The parliaments and press of every country stood vigilant to detect the slightest symptoms of tender-heartedness or philosophic indifference. Even the prestige which sprang from absolute victory did not protect them from constant scrutiny and suspicion. In every victorious state there rose the cry, "Our soldiers have won the war. Let us make sure our politicians do not throw away the peace." These European leaders represented their democracies best in all in which they differed from President Wilson most. And where was he? He had pledged and was about to recommit the United States to the service of mankind. "We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." Footnote: in a speech on April 2, 1917. End of footnote. And again on the deck of the George Washington to Mr. Creel, "It is to America that the whole world turns today, not only with its wrongs, but with its hopes and grievances. The hungry expect us to feed them. The roofless look to us for shelter. The sick of heart and body depend upon us for cure. All of these expectations have in them the quality of terrible urgency. There must be no delay. Yet you know, and I know, that these ancient wrongs, these present unhappinesses, are not to be remedied in a day or with a wave of the hand. What I seem to see, with all my heart I hope that I am wrong, is a tragedy of disappointment." Footnote: in The War, the World, and Wilson by George Creel, page 163. End of footnote. The misgiving was justified. The American populace fell as far short of their chief in disinterested generosity to the world as the peoples of the Allied countries exceeded their own leaders in severity to the enemy. The President himself was without a majority both in the Senate and in the newly elected Congress. Already ex-President Roosevelt had brutally proclaimed, "Our allies and our enemies and Mr. Wilson himself should all understand that Mr. Wilson has no authority whatever to speak for the American people at this time." Much lower and cruder views than his were to prevail on both sides of the Atlantic. The Allies were destined to settle their affairs among themselves. The agreements to which President Wilson sought to commit the United States, for which the Allies would be asked to concede many grave things, were to be swiftly repudiated by the American Senate and electors. After immense delays and false hopes that only aggravated her difficulties, Europe was to be left to scramble out of the world disaster as best she could, and the United States, which had lost but 125,000 lives in the whole struggle, was to settle down upon the basis of receiving, through one channel or another, 4/5 of the reparations paid by Germany to the countries she had devastated or whose manhood she had slain. To write thus is not to blame peoples or their leading men. It is only to recognize the comparatively low level upon which the intercourse of vast communities can proceed at the present stage in human development. How could the peoples know? Through what channels could they receive their instruction? What coed and integral conviction could they form? How could they express it? Vague general ideas, some harsh, some noble, attracted them from day to day. But in the main they were so glad the war had stopped that each individual family was thinking of nothing so much as reunion and building up again the home, the business, the old life. Wilson created world democracy in his own image. In fact, however, the plain people of whom he spoke so much, though very resolute and persevering in war, knew nothing whatever about how to make a just and durable peace. Punish the Germans, no more war, and something for our own country. Above all, come home, were the only mass ideas then rife. If Wilson had been either simply an idealist or a caucus politician, he might have succeeded. His attempt to run the two in double harness was the cause of his undoing. The spacious philanthropy which he exhaled upon Europe stopped quite sharply at the coasts of his own country. There he was in every main decision a party politician, calculating and brazen. A tithe of the fine principles and generous sentiments he lavished upon Europe, applied during 1918 to his Republican opponents in the United States, would have made him, in truth, the leader of a nation. His sense of proportion operated in separate watertight compartments. The differences in Europe between France and Germany seemed trivial, petty, easy to be adjusted by a little good sense and charity. But the differences between Democrat and Republic in the United States? Here were really grave quarrels. He could not understand why the French should not be more forgiving to their beaten enemy, nor why the American Republicans should not expect cold comfort from a democratic administration. His gaze was fixed with equal earnestness upon the destiny of mankind and the fortunes of his party candidates. Peace and goodwill among all nations abroad, but no truck with the Republican Party at home. That was his ticket, and that was his ruin, and the ruin of much else as well. It is difficult for a man to do great things if he tries to combine a lambent charity embracing the whole world with the sharper forms of populist party strife. The first shock which the President and his delegation is said to have received was confrontation with the secret treaties made between the Allies during the war. Mr. Baker, in lurid pages, had gloated upon their unmoral character. The old diplomacy, what it stood for. The secret treaties, the Turkish Empire as booty, the slump in idealism. From the headings of chapters which reveal to the American public European baseness and their own correctitude. But let us see what had actually occurred. The American thesis after the United States entered the war was that the Germans represented the most violent form of military aggression recorded by history. England and France had been fighting against this monster since August 4, 1914. In the spring of 1915, Italy had shown a disposition to come and help them. The accession of their side of a nation of 35 millions, mobilizing an army 1.5 million strong, seemed to be a matter of the highest consequence. But Italy appeared to have a move either way. And the Germans were eagerly displaying to Italian eyes the advantages to Italy of playing a true part in the Triple Alliance. Instead of seeking the Trentino from Austria, why not take Savoy from France? And so on, bid and counterbid. We should wrong the Italians by suggesting that their decision was taken on these material grounds. But who can blame the Allied statesmen for dwelling upon the superior advantages which Italy could obtain at the expense of Austria and of Turkey? The Treaty of London, upon which Italy entered the war on the Allied side, embodied the belief that to France and Britain the aid of Italy spelled speedy victory, and that her hostility might mean their total defeat. In the same way, Romania, who had equally great prizes to gain by adhering to either combination, provided it emerged victorious, was the subject in 1916 of every form of threat and inducement which states at desperate leaguer could present. Such were the secret treaties entered into by the Allies in their distress and jeopardy in order to secure reinforcements. Another series of secret agreements had been made among the Allies themselves, to keep themselves in good temper with each other. In 1914, 1915, and 1916, Russian assistance was vital. France was bleeding to death. The British armies were only just becoming a prime factor in the field. To keep the struggling Russian colossus in good heart, to avoid all excuses for estrangement, was the first duty of Britain and French diplomacy. Turkey, which had been offered territorial integrity on the guarantee of France, Britain, and Russia, had joined the Germans and had made an unprovoked assault upon Russia. No one was going to shed many tears about the break-up of the Turkish Empire or the end of Turkish domination over Christian and Arab races. The assignment of spheres of interests over the non-Turkish provinces of Turkey became at once a necessity and a convenience to the Allies. England, abandoning the policy of generations, consented to the prospect of a Russian Constantinople and dwelt upon her own interests in the Persian Gulf and in Mesopotamia. France asserted her historic claims to Syria. Italy was assured that none of her allies would obstruct her ambitions in Adalia, nor indeed upon the Alps and in the Adriatic. An understanding about Persia had for many years been an indispensable foundation of good Anglo-Russian relations. These arrangements had to be recast on the assumption of a general victory in which the Turkish Empire would have disappeared. Mr. Baker pretends that all these inter-allied agreements represented the inherent cynical wickedness and materialism of old-world diplomacy. They were, in the main, simply convulsive gestures of self-preservation. The greater part of these secret treaties was found to be conformable to the principles laid down by President Wilson in his 14 points and was consented to by him in the ultimate settlement. There were features in all of them which nothing but duress could explain and excuse. But Mr. Baker and the United States delegation had no grounds for taking a lofty and judicial view of these transactions. If the United States had entered the war, a war as they subsequently described it, of right and justice against unspeakable wrong and tyranny, on the 4th of August, the world would never have come into this plight. American statesmen could have judged for themselves, in concert with the ministers of England, France, and Russia, what conditions, if any, might fittingly be offered to procure the adherence of Italy. If the United States had entered the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, they could have judged for themselves how far it was right to go to prevent Romania being drawn into the orbit of the Central Powers. If even 2 years after the outbreak of war they had joined the Allies, they could have regulated at their pleasure any arrangements made with Japan about Shantung and China generally. One has a right to stand on the bank, but if one has exercised the right for a prolonged and agonizing period without even throwing a rope to a man struggling in the rapids, some allowance could be made for the swimmer who now clutches at this rock and now at that in rough or ungainly fashion. It is not open to the cool bystander, who afterwards becomes the loyal and ardent comrade and brave rescuer, to set himself up as an impartial judge of events which never would have occurred had he outstretched a helping hand in time. Mr. Baker produces his first film tableau when he shows us the hearty, whole-souled American delegation suddenly confronted on their arrival with this labyrinth of secret treaties. The President had never heard of their existence. Mr. Lansing, with all the resources of the State Department at his disposal, had never dreamt of them. But here they were, naked and horrible, now flung on the table of the peace conference and blotting the fair layout of the 14 points. Can we wonder that the moral sense of the American people recoiled? No such effect had been produced since Fatima opened the secret chamber of Bluebeard. In fact, however, the government of the United States, we cannot speak for individuals, had been made aware of the gist of each of these secret treaties, and could at any time after their entry into the war have obtained every detail by merely asking. Most remarkable of all, in their memorable dispatch of November 29, 1918, the French government, as we have seen, had formally proposed to the American State Department that all secret agreements should be abrogated forthwith before any peace negotiations were begun. And Mr. Lansing had left this note without an answer. But here Mr. Baker shall speak for himself. He speaks very fairly. In America we knew little and cared less about these European secret treaties. Our national interests were at no point affected by them. Everyone knew, indeed, that Italy had driven a hard bargain when she came into the war on the side of the Allies. But this was war, and in war anything may be necessary. Even the State Department of the United States, which is the organization especially charged with the duty of knowing about foreign affairs, seems to have had no interest in these secret treaties, and if Secretary Lansing is to be believed, little or no knowledge of them. While the President must have known in general of these secret agreements, for he often excoriated the practice of secret diplomacy, he apparently made no attempt to secure any vital or comprehensive knowledge. When Mr. Balfour came to Washington as the British Commissioner in 1917, he explained certain of these treaties to Colonel House. Colonel House, however, said he was not particularly interested, because it seemed to him more important to bend all energies to the winning of the war, and he finally told Mr. Balfour that they were dividing the bearskin before the bear had been killed. The President's advisers thus underestimated the importance of the whole matter, and felt that to waste any time on it would only interfere with the energetic prosecution of the war, which they believed was the most important consideration of the moment. They trusted, as did the whole country, that all would come right in the end once we had licked the Kaiser. If our diplomatic service lacked a background of comprehension of the significance of the secret treaties, what should be said about public opinion? Venturing into a totally unfamiliar scene, driven blindly by a blast of war feeling, a few leaves of secret engagements in the wind meant absolutely nothing to it. But surely all this was masculine good sense. And if these excuses for carelessness or indifference are valid for the United States government and people, how much more do they protect the Allies? If America can be pardoned for being driven blindly by a blast of war feeling into underrating or ignoring the significance of such transactions, surely England and France, streaming with blood, seared in the flame of battle, with their dearest dead and national life at stake, may be excused for setting them in a similar twilight. It is at once silly and unjust to pretend that these partitions of possible war gains had any substantial relation to the causes for which the Allies were fighting the war. When wars begin, much is added to the original cause of quarrel, and many results follow never aimed at or cared for at the beginning. When the United States in 1898 declared war upon Spain, it was with no thought of taking the Philippine Islands and subjugating the Philippine Islanders. Yet both these events followed inevitably or incidentally from their victory. It is no less a calumny upon France and England to say that they fought for the booty of Turkey, than to say that the United States picked a quarrel with Spain in order to annex and conquer the Philippines. And it is perhaps a good thing to clear these calumnies out of the way, even if it somewhat mars the film effects in which Mr. Stannard Baker delights. However, here were the secret treaties to which the faith of great countries was pledged and their signatures appended. And they ran criss-cross, not in the main, but in some important instances, to the broad and simple theories of the 14 points. Mr. Lloyd George and the British peace delegation had crossed the Channel on January 10. They were accompanied by naval and military authorities. They had been preceded by a large and elaborate staff of experts and officials who filled to overflowing one of the largest hotels in Paris. The competence of this staff, the fund of knowledge of history, law, and economics which it commanded, and its methods of conducting business have gained the respect both of ally and enemy observers. As for the slim white booklets of the English experts, says a German writer, dealing with Belgian neutrality, with the Rhine problem, with the Danube, with the possible future of Little Luxembourg, and heaven knows what besides, the number of these books was legion. Of all the rival guides to the maze of the troubled earth which awaited reshaping, the English collection was the amplest and was generally felt to be more systematically and concisely arranged than either the American or the French. Even members of the American and French delegations frequently consulted the little white books in their search for enlightenment on obscure subjects on which they were called upon to pronounce or prophesy. Footnote by Novak in Versailles, page 34. End of footnote. The great machine was directed and focused for business by the comparatively small instrument of the War Cabinet Secretariat, which had been perfected during the preceding 4 years by the organizing insight and measureless industry of Maurice Hankey. This officer of Marines, while still a young captain, had become in 1912 the secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defense. He had been responsible for the war book, which had been the key to the whole transition of Britain from peace to war in 1914. He had kept and arranged the records of all the great business which had come first before the War Committee of the Cabinet and later before the War Cabinet during the war and the armistice. He knew everything. He could put his hand on anything. He knew everybody. He said nothing. He gained the confidence of all. And finally he became, by the natural flow of their wishes, the sole recorder for the decisive 6 weeks of the conversations between President Wilson, Monsieur Clemenceau, and Mr. Lloyd George, by which the peace was settled. The British plenipotentiaries were reinforced by the British Empire delegation, consisting of the prime ministers of the self-governing dominions, the representatives of India, and 4 or 5 ministers in charge of the great executive departments, of whom I was at this time one. This body was purely consultative. It assembled in Paris only when required by the Prime Minister, and its members were widely dispersed in other activities. In contrast to President Wilson's isolation from the Senate, it was Lloyd George's policy to fortify himself at important moments by the counsel and agreement of the leaders of the whole British Empire. This was his Senate, and he moved through the darkness and confusion of the Paris firmament, always surrounded by numerous and shining satellites. At his side, with matchless experience and a calm, imperturbable wisdom, stood Arthur Balfour, and, must we not add, Louis Botha. Were labor questions raised, Barnes, the veteran trade unionist, could speak as a working man. Did he require exponents of the liberal creed in international affairs, General Smuts and Lord Robert Cecil could meet President Wilson on his own ground and speak his language to Wilson's surprise and gratification. Was there a moment when the robust instincts of youthful conquering pioneer states deserved expression, Mr. Hughes of Australia and Mr. Massey of New Zealand were at hand, with Sir Robert Borden of Canada not far away. If the panorama of the East or Middle East should be lighted, Maharajas and emirs of 1,000 years historic descent advanced in glittering gravity. Himself singularly free from the perversion of the historic sense which degenerates into egotism, the Prime Minister parcelled out great functions and occasions among his colleagues and those whom he wished to persuade or conciliate, and by modesty in good fortune preserved intact his own controlling power. Thus he was well fitted in himself for the impending ordeal and equipped with a fine apparatus. On the other hand, he reached the conference somewhat dishevelled by the vulgarities and blatancies of the recent general election. Pinned to his coat-tails were the posters, "Hang the Kaiser," "Search their pockets," "Make them pay," and this sensibly detracted from the dignity of his entrance upon the scene. The actors had arrived, the stage was set, and the audience already clamoured for the curtain to rise. But the play and its method of presentation were still unsettled. We have seen how President Wilson had rejected the original French plan of November 29, 1918, for a preliminary settlement upon essentials by the 4 or 5 principal partners in the war, and how he had wished for a general assembly of the victors, over which he should himself preside, and before which he could lay his schemes for the better government of mankind. His mere unspoken dissent from the French proposals had been sufficient to delay all prior consultation between the Allied powers. But now everyone met face to face, and practical decisions must forthwith be taken. The President came immediately into contact with personalities who were certainly his equals in force and experience, and who guarded the vital interests of mighty nations which, in the long drawn-out struggle, had staked their all and won. The glowing if nebulous ideas he may have cherished of haranguing the old world into a nobler way of life and marshalling to the support, if necessary over the heads of their own chosen leaders, the public opinions of the various countries, must now give place to silk and steel conversations with Clemenceau and Lloyd George. From January 12 onwards, meetings were held of the 5 principal powers, each with 2 representatives. These meetings were at first intended only to settle procedure and inaugurate the plenary conference. But as they succeeded one another day after day, the body assumed an impressive shape and came almost at once to be called the Council of Ten. The Council of Ten first discussed the constitution of the peace conference and its control. Wilson was in favor of the whole 27 states meeting together upon more or less equal terms. Clemenceau demurred. Am I to understand from the statement of President Wilson that there can be no question, however important it may be for France, England, Italy, or America, upon which the representative of Honduras or of Cuba shall not be called upon to express his opinion? I have hitherto always been of the opinion that it was agreed that the 5 great powers should reach their decision upon important questions before entering the halls of Congress to negotiate peace. If a new war should take place, Germany would not throw all her forces upon Cuba or upon Honduras, but upon France. It would always be upon France. I request, then, that we stand by the proposals which have been made, proposals to the effect that meetings be held in which the representatives of the 5 countries mentioned shall participate, to reach decisions upon the important questions, and that the study of secondary questions be turned over to the commissions and the committees before the reunion of the conference. He was supported by Mr. Lloyd George, and evidently commanded the agreement of Italy and Japan. Lansing thought that Wilson should insist. He contemplated apparently the President forming a bloc or lobby of small states and outvoting the great powers. Wilson's inherent good sense saved him from this folly. He proposed as a compromise that informal conversations should be held among the great powers simultaneously with the plenary conferences of all the nations. This was no compromise at all. It was a recognition of facts. The Council of Ten were to converse and not to confer, but they were to continue. This was readily agreed to. The next problem was the press. No less than 500 special correspondents had gathered in Paris, the most able, competent writers in every country, representing the most powerful newspapers and the largest circulations. The sense of history was strong upon all these men, and also the importance of getting it in first. Every day the cables and the wireless had to be charged with tens of thousands of words directed to every printing office in the globe, describing how the great peace was going to be made. Except from the French press, which was carefully looked after, all the gag of war censorship had been removed. The whole 500 stood together in the truest comradeship and the keenest rivalry, and all chanted aloud in chorus the first of the 14 points which seemed specially drafted for their benefit, namely, open covenants of peace openly arrived at. Mr. Wilson was seriously embarrassed at this application of his doctrine. He hastened to repeat that he had not intended that every delicate matter must at every stage be discussed in the newspapers of the world. Obviously, one had to draw the line somewhere. But this made no impression. The people of the United States must have news, or at least copy, day by day. And the British and French could scarcely be expected to be fed only through American channels. The great question was, said Mr. Stanard Baker, what would democracy do with diplomacy? On the one hand, 100 million strong, stood the young American democracy. On the other, cowered furtively, but at the same time obstinately, and even truculently, the old European diplomacy. Here young, healthy, hearty, ardent millions advancing so hopefully to reform mankind. There, shrinking from the limelights, cameras and cinemas, huddled the crafty, cunning, intriguing, high-collared, gold-laced diplomatists. Tableau, curtain, slow music, sobs, and afterwards chocolates. Open covenants of peace openly arrived at. If this meant anything, it surely meant a vast world debate upon the war settlement, and that all the plain people in the lands, the plain blacks as well as the plain whites, should consciously and intelligently participate in the grand solution. But how to bring this about? The plain people were busy getting their daily bread. They had no time to listen to all the frantic pleadings and protests which arose. One tale was good until another was told, and probably both were untrue and certainly very difficult to understand. Nevertheless, here were the plain people represented by a highly colored press, and here was point 1 of the 14, which said that the covenants of peace were to be openly arrived at. However, it is curious that the press fared a good deal worse in the peace than they had in the war. In fact, their fortunes were unexpectedly reversed. They had begun the war brushed contemptuously aside by the generals, excluded from the war zone, and straitjacketed by the censorship. They had soon compelled generals and politicians to come to heel. They emerged from the war at the highest point of their power and influence. They were still in the mood to break governments and dictate policy. But war conditions had passed, and as the parliaments and the platform revived, the newspapers and their proprietors were gradually brought to a more reasonable view of their function. Their first experience of the horrors of peace was to learn that none of the 14 points applied to them, and that the Council of 10 would meet in secret. A discussion at times rather heated then took place, upon what was to be the official language. France claimed that French was by long custom the official language of diplomacy, that the French were the hosts of the conference, and that France had suffered more than anyone else. Britain, with her dominions, and the United States, all acting together, said, as opportunity offered, that they represented 160 millions of English-speaking people and were in a large majority. Neither side would agree to abate its claims, so both languages were declared official, and an Italian attempt for the recognition of a third language was not successful. The way was then clear for business, and on January 18 the first plenary session of the Peace Conference opened. It was time. More than 2 months had passed since the armistice. The interval had been filled by the British general election, by President Wilson's journey to Europe, and by the French preparations, certainly not unduly hurried, for the greatest international gathering that has ever taken place. Meanwhile, the armies had advanced into Germany and taken possession of the Rhine bridgeheads. Allied officers and missions, clad in the brand-new authority of conquest, had moved freely about through Austria, Turkey, and Bulgaria, giving such directions as they thought necessary or thought fit to these entirely submissive populations. The French, with the Greeks at their side, had landed at Odessa, of which more later. British divisions had occupied the railway across the Caucasus, and British flotillas rode the Caspian as well as the Rhine. Allenby's armies had effectively occupied all Syria and joined hands with the Anglo-Indian armies in Mesopotamia. But these purely military measures, although for the moment they seemed effective, only masked the deepening chaos in which so many vast defeated communities were involved. The greater part of Europe and Asia simply existed locally from day to day. Revolutions, disorders, the vengeance of peoples upon rulers who had led them to their ruin, partisan warfare, brigandage of all kinds, and, over wide areas, actual famine lapped the Baltic states, Central and Southern Europe, Asia Minor, Arabia, and all Russia in indescribable confusion. These were fearful months for a large proportion of mankind, nor was the end in sight. But behind these tribulations, new and often inordinate hopes and ambitions everywhere reared their heads. The Baltic states sought their independence, and each strove desperately to erect some form of ordered government. Germany was in actual revolution. A communist uprising, eventually choked in blood, taught Munich a lesson never to be forgotten. Hungary was soon to fall under the oppression of Bela Kun, an offshoot of the Moscow fungus sprouting independently at Budapest. The Austrian Empire was in utter dissolution. Poland was rising again out of the wreck of the three empires by whom she had been partitioned 150 years before. Bohemia, under the shield of Masaryk and Beneš, was accepted as an ally by the victors. The remnants of Romanian society and army, which had straggled back to their devastated country after the withering Treaty of Bucharest, now rapidly overran Transylvania. The Italians poured into the Tyrol, and passing the Adriatic, soon came face to face with fierce, gaunt, unconquerable Serbs who now called themselves Yugoslavs. The Arabs under Faisal, with the fierce Lawrence bound in blood brotherhood to their cause, had settled down in Damascus and dreamt of a great Arabia from Alexandretta to Aden, and from Jerusalem to Baghdad. Not only the victors but the vanquished, not only the peoples but parties and classes proclaimed their ambitions. Appetites, passions, hopes, revenge, starvation, and anarchy ruled the hour. And from this simultaneous and almost universal welter, all eyes were turned to Paris. To this immortal city, gay, tragic, haggard, triumphant, scarred and crowned, more than half mankind now looked for satisfaction or deliverance.